but participate, make suggestions, things like that. And even as a 6-year-old, I mean, my dad was having to read the lines at the read-through, and I would just kind of sit there at first.
For a child like Howard, who was used to the gentle, paternal guidance of his own father, Rance Howard, Briner was an alien force. He was a man who didn't speak. He issued decrees. He didn't walk. He processed. Howard recalls being genuinely frightened by Briner's intensity. The actor had a way of looking through people rather than at them, a technique designed to maintain his status as the most important person in any room. In the world of 50s cinema, stars like Briner were protected by a studio system that treated them as gods. And Briner leaned into that divinity with every fiber of his being. This was a lesson in the atmosphere of fear. Howard watched as adult crew members, seasoned professionals who had worked on dozens of films, scrambled to appease Briner's every whim. If the lighting wasn't perfect, if a line was flubbed, if the energy on set wasn't exactly to his liking, Briner's disapproval wasn't a conversation, it was a climate shift. For Howard, this was a formative experience in understanding how a single ego can hijack a collective creative process. It was the antithesis of the collaborative spirit Howard would later champion as a director. Briner was the immovable object, a man whose commitment to his own myth outweighed the comfort of his colleagues. The friction here wasn't born of a personal grudge. It's unlikely Briner even considered a 5-year-old a peer worth having a grudge with, but rather a fundamental clash of philosophies. Howard was learning that the Midwestern style of work, be prepared, be kind, and be part of the team, Briner represented the continental style, be the spectacle, be the mystery, and be the master. Howard has noted that Briner's presence was so overwhelming that it felt like the air left the room when he entered. This wasn't just stardom. It was a form of professional tyranny that relied on the subordination of everyone else's identity. Briner also possessed a legendary penchant for control over his image. He was a talented photographer and a man of high culture, but these interests often served to further distance him from the common folk on set. He wouldn't engage in the small talk or the camaraderie that builds a sense of safety for a young performer. Instead, he maintained a wall of exoticism. He was the other, a figure of such intense self-seriousness that it bordered on the absurd. Howard, even at a young age, could sense that this wasn't just acting. It was a lifestyle of curated dominance. Decades later, when Howard transitioned into directing, the ghost of Yul Brynner likely sat on his shoulder as a reminder of what not to do. Howard's sets are famously relaxed and egalitarian, a direct reaction to the emperor model he witnessed in his youth. He learned from Briner that while fear can produce a powerful performance, it also creates a brittle environment where people are too afraid to innovate. Briner showed him that the icon is often a cage not just for the people working with them, but for the actor themselves who must constantly perform their own greatness. Howard's time with Briner was a baptism by fire. It taught him that Hollywood wasn't just a playground. It was a hierarchy. To survive, one had to learn how to stand their ground in the shadow of a giant. Briner was the ultimate personification of the golden age's darkest trait, The belief that genius grants a license to be unreachable. He was a king without a kingdom, ruling over a soundstage with an iron fist, leaving a young Ron Howard to wonder if there was a way to reach the top without losing one's humanity. Briner ruled by presence, but in the 80s, Howard would face a new kind of defiance, the intellectual blockade. Shelley Long, The Perfectionists. Purgatory, where Yelbranter's dominance was a relic of a vanishing empire. Shelley Long represented a modern, more cerebral kind of friction. By 1982, Ron Howard was at a crossroads. He was no longer the child actor under the thumb of icons. He was a young director trying to prove he had the authority to lead a major feature film. The project was Night Shift, a comedy that required a delicate balance of zany energy and grounded heart. In Shelley Long, Howard found a brilliant comedian, but he also encountered an analytical anchor, an actress whose process was so meticulous and questioning that it threatened to grind the production to a halt. Long came from the rigorous world of Chicago's Second City, a background that emphasized intellectual deconstruction and character motivation, while Michael Keaton was improvising at a mile a minute and Henry Winkler was leaning into his natural warmth. Long was often the brakes on the set. She didn't just want to say the lines. She wanted to know the molecular structure of why her character Belinda would choose those specific words. For Howard, this was a baptism into the world of star management. He wasn't just directing a movie. He was negotiating a daily peace treaty between the schedule and a star's obsessive perfectionism. The friction with Long wasn't born of malice, but of a mismatch in tempo. Howard, having grown up in the high-efficiency world of sitcoms, where time is money, valued momentum. Long, conversely, seemed to view the set as a laboratory. Industry lore and cast reflections from that era often paint a picture of an actress who was not always the easiest to get along with. Not because she was a diva in the fur coat and tantrum sense, but because she was a perfectionist who could be oblivious to the needs of the ensemble. On the set of Night Shift, this manifested as endless questions and a desire for one more take long after the director was satisfied. Howard had to learn a vital lesson in directorial psychology. The analytical anchor isn't trying to be evil. They are trying to be safe. For Long, the scrutiny of every detail was a shield against failure. But for a director, that shield can become a wall. Howard found himself in a position where he had to validate her concerns without letting them sabotage the film's energy. This was his first real experience with the intellectual blockade, a situation where an actor uses their intelligence as a form of control. If they can outthink the director, they can effectively take over the set. The tension was exacerbated by the technical habits Long developed, habits that would later become famous on the set of Cheers. There were whispers that she would accidentally move in ways that forced the camera to stay on her. A subtle form of scene stealing that drove co-stars to frustration. On Night Shift, this created a competitive atmosphere that stood in stark contrast to the family of vibe Howard craved. He realized that a director's job isn't just about the camera. It's about managing the gravity of the stars. Long had a high gravitational pull, and if Howard didn't stay firm, the entire movie would be sucked into her singular orbit. This experience was a turning point for Howard's leadership style. He realized that being a nice guy wasn't enough. He had to be a clear guy. He learned to set boundaries with performers who equated process with stalling. He also learned to appreciate the result, even if the journey was grueling. Lon is undoubtedly brilliant in Night Shift, bringing a vulnerability to Belinda that another actress might have missed. Howard recognized that the friction produced a diamond, but the heat of that friction nearly melted the machine. Looking back, the beef with Shelley Long is a classic example of the director's dilemma. How much of a star's difficult behavior do you tolerate for the sake of the performance? Long challenged Howard to find his voice. She showed him that even in a comedy about morgue attendants and love brokers, the internal psychological battles are where the real drama lives. She was the first person to show him that the most difficult part of directing isn't the lighting or the script. It's the human ego disguised as the work. Where Long used questions to slow the gears, the next star used raw, unpredictable fire to heat them. Russell Crowe, the volatile alchemist. If Shelley Long's friction was a slow-motion intellectual grind, Russell Crowe was a lightning strike. By the time Ron Howard cast Crowe in A Beautiful Mind, the actor was already a legend of the mercurial variety, a man whose physical intensity and hair-trigger temperament were as famous as his Oscar-caliber talent. Howard, the perennial seeker of harmony, was suddenly tasked with directing a volatile alchemist, a performer who believed that great art could only be forged in the heat of a high-pressure furnace. This was not a clash of styles, but a clash of temperaments, the boy next door versus the gladiator. Crowe brought a method intensity to the set that often translated into a desire for total creative control. He didn't just play John Nash. He occupied him and he expected the production to bend to the needs of that occupation. Howard has recounted that Crowe would ask good hard questions, which is the director's polite shorthand for intense multi-hour debates about a single line of dialogue or the placement of a prop. Crowe was a man who used his intelligence and his physical presence to dominate the space. On the set of A Beautiful Mind and later Cinderella Man, the friction was palpable. Crowe was known for a short fuse, famously getting into an altercation with a producer at an awards show during this era, and that danger followed him onto the soundstage. For Howard, managing Crowe was a lesson in the burden of brilliance. He realized that with certain actors, that evil isn't a lack of professionalism, but an excess of it, a commitment so deep it becomes destructive to the social fabric of the crew. Howard had to act as a lion tamer, providing enough space for Crowe's genius to roam without letting it maul the supporting cast or the schedule. The friction here was about boundaries. Crowe would push, and Howard, in his quiet but firm way, had to push back. It was a high-stakes poker game played out over months of filming where the currency was respect. One of the most famous examples of this friction occurred when Crowe insisted on shooting A Beautiful Mind in chronological order, a logistical nightmare for any production, let alone one with a modest budget. Howard initially resisted, citing the mosaic Nature of film. But Crow was relentless. He argued that the psychological decay of John Nash couldn't be faked by jumping around the timeline. In a rare move, Howard pivoted. He saw that Crow wasn't being difficult for the sake of ego. He was being difficult for the sake of the truth. This was the turning point in their relationship. Howard learned that with a volatile alchemist, you don't fight the fire, you channel it. However, the psychological toll on Howard was significant.